Before we start, I want to thank Seth Godfrey and Rory Martorana, who helped put this program together. Rory is working behind the scenes as we speak. And just so the audience knows, as we go along, if you have any questions for Professor Snowden, you can enter them using the Q&A feature. If you're following along on Facebook, you can also ask questions there, and hopefully they'll be forwarded to me. And without further ado, I'd just like to introduce Professor Frank Snowden. He is the Andrew Downey Orrick Professor Emeritus of History and History of Medicine at Yale University. He received his PhD from Oxford in 1975, and his work is concentrated on, among other subjects, modern Italian history. He's the author of the books Violence and Great Estates in the South of Italy, The Fascist Revolution in Tuscany, Naples in the Time of Cholera, and The Conquest of Malaria, Italy, 1900 to 1962. In 2019, he published Epidemics and Society, From the Black Death to the Present, which is a truly fascinating book about disease and the human responses to it and how they have shaped our lives both. And we're very glad to have you today at the library. So I think
I'm delighted to be with you.
Did you want to start off by talking about COVID-19 or your book?
Maybe I should, since it's the library talking about books, and maybe I should begin by just talking about how this came to be, the book that I wrote, and say that there are two things. One is a long-term, which is an experience I had of actually living through a cholera epidemic in Rome in 1973, and I wasn't interested in medical history at that point at all, but I really did find that I was stunned by a lot of the things that were occurring. That, for example, cars, it broke out in Naples, and so in Rome, cars with Naples license plates, doesn't this sound all too familiar, were being stoned. And there were fruit vendors and their stalls in marketplaces, and they were being overturned and attacked because seafood was said to be the cause, or perhaps tainted vegetables. And then, so I began to wonder, how are these things happening? Why? And then this Italy at the time was the world's seventh major industrial power, and the prime minister and the minister of health actually went on television and said, you don't need to worry because the microbe that causes cholera is exquisitely sensitive to acid. So all you need to do is get a lemon, and then you get your raw mussels in front of you and you're ready to eat them. Just squeeze on a little bit of lemon juice and you'll be just fine. If you believe that, you'll believe anything. So I wondered also about this. So after a while, these questions began to gather momentum, and I just eventually sort of thought, well, actually, the medical history really does show what people's values really are and how societies are put together and what the fracture lines are within them. So that was kind of the fascination of history of medicine that drew me into that. And specifically, the epidemics book, with that, against that background, the idea of it, not as a book, but just as a series of lectures, began from the students I was teaching, who pointed out to me during the SARS epidemic that, in fact, they were really nervous. And they could, of course, get information from their doctors about what to do personally. And if they got sick, they wouldn't have obviously asked me about that because I'm, that's not me. But there were things they said that they did wonder about, which is the context that public health people and physicians don't usually deal with, like, why is our society going through this? What does it mean? Is it unprecedented? Will it ever end? Those sorts of questions. And so I thought I had an obligation. They also said that in the curriculum, epidemic history really wasn't taught. And that's not only true at Yale, but so many other places. And that you could study diseases, but that was in the lab where you're actually talking about their biological side rather than their historical features. So I felt that there was something that someone really needed to deal with those questions and those issues. And that's what became later the book that's now Epidemics and Society. It started with my students.
And it turns out that examining history that way is a really fascinating way to understand the history itself and understand why certain things have happened as they have. I mean, just I really can't say enough how much your book has taught me, and it's very well written, and I would urge everyone to take a look at it. You cover a huge number of topics, a huge number of illnesses, infectious diseases, and it's hard kind of to know where to start. But one of the themes, it seems to me, that you talk about is how we understand where diseases emerge from. And this seems to like the causation of disease. And this seems to be something that people have struggled with. And I would be interested to hear your thoughts on whether we still continue to struggle with that idea of how disease spreads, where it comes from. So at some point, people bought into the miasma theory about polluted air, and that's a big part of your book. Both before and I would assume after that, people have believed that the god or the devil inflicted diseases. So there's a lot of morality involved, or immorality. And you kind of trace how this scientific development happened, and you tell a really interesting story about an Italian experimental philosopher in the mid 1600s who did an experiment where which demonstrated to him that organic matter really couldn't grow out of inorganic matter, that there had to be some other elements in play. And yet it was a couple of hundred years later, and prominent scientists were still wondering if at the molecular level, something organic could grow out of really nothing, could kind of, de novo, anew, be created. Can you talk a little bit about that whole, I know it's a huge question, but that's sort of that whole theme?
Well, the idea, this has a major scientific idea, but it also was a major philosophical and theological debate with those sorts of ramifications. So although it may seem odd to us, at the time, people were very passionate about it on both sides. And also, we can't really go back and reconstruct the thought mode because we've learned evidence that's pretty much ends the debate. But at the time, it was deeply wondered, people wondered very deeply, was it possible, in fact, to create not to create, but for there to be created out of nothing something that causes diseases? Or did it have to have some sort of link to organic material elsewhere? Now, practically, that may sound very abstruse, but it had enormous practical implications, because if you can create something out of nothing, it means that you can have a cholera epidemic and you don't have to look to where it came from. It didn't come from anywhere. It just started there. It also means that the way you deal with patients is very different, because it means that if it comes out of nowhere, that means that an oak tree also can come from nothing and then transform perhaps into a plague. Or plague can turn into pneumonia. And if you have that kind of lack of specificity of understanding where diseases come from, then you really have no epidemiology. You have no way also of founding sensible public health. So that debate really had to be settled before, and that was what Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch did, was to settle that debate once and for all. They were ridiculed at the time, which is also hard for us to understand, especially Pasteur. But people thought also, my goodness, how can a full-grown adult person, actually be done in by something you can't even see that's so tiny, ridiculous. And people ridiculed him in that way, but he gets the last laugh.
And, at the risk of going too much into this, is that not, so much in the scientific community, but among people, is that still an ongoing, seems like almost intuitive misconception that we carry with us, that, well, if you're out in the cold, you can catch cold. Maybe it develops from within you, because you're shivering and you're cold. Now we know, I think, that certain conditions can dispose us to contracting an illness from outside of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But there still seems to be a lot of misunderstanding of where certain illnesses, not infectious illnesses, develop from.
In fact, this now has, I think, now that it is known where infectious disease, so much isn't known, but there's some debates that you don't need to keep having century after century. And one of those is that infectious diseases come from organisms, and you get them by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But nonetheless, there is what I think people always want to explain something somehow. And if they don't have the sort of preparation in their minds for how things actually work, they'll invent their own causation. And sometimes it takes very sinister forms. So we see that, stigma is one of the things that happens so often in the history of infectious diseases. HIV is the gay plague, that sort of thing. Or we've seen it in COVID, Black Death. There was vast anti-Semitic pogroms because it was said that Jews were trying to poison the wells of Christians to destroy Christianity. And so people put them to death in vast numbers. And we see, if you read the daily newspapers, that during COVID-19, and it's not only in our own country, but certainly in our own country, there have been thousands of reported, which means that the real number is way above that, incidents of attacks and assaults on people of Asian origin. And somehow this is something that comes from within being Asian, this virus. And so we have people being stabbed and killed, or spit upon or assaulted, and all the rest of it. So I think ignoring science can also have these really dangerous undertows that make the disease experience, which is awful. The pandemic is awful enough, isn't it? Without also having people being killed for being Asian or not. And they didn't even make distinctions, of course. Supposedly, people said that it was the Wuhan virus, which was a rejection of science. But then they didn't, I guess bigots don't make fine distinctions. And so if you're of Korean descent or Vietnamese or Cambodian or Laotian or from Thailand, even the Philippines, that's good enough. And so you could still be attacked for being the origin of this vaccine. So, or else a sinister plot that someone is trying like the Jews in the 15th century is trying to kill us off, and that it's not really a natural event at all. It's a poison that somehow being spread. So I think lack of scientific grounding for the general public, that's one of the things that we discover as a lesson that needs to be learned from this pandemic. And we really need, with that, to combat it, careful messaging at the out. That's something we didn't get in this country, that explaining in other countries that dealt better, the president or prime minister and leading health advisors would go on television every day explaining to people what the situation was, where it came from, what they can do about it, and all of that. And we had, each state had its own policy, each school board, each municipality, and New York City opposes New York State, and it goes on and on and on. So we weren't really well served by that, and we fell victim to this desire of people to explain something, and if you don't know how to explain it, well, you invent it.
Right. There was really a complete, as you say, failure of unified federal leadership. So, everyone was left to kind of make their own decisions, and that is continuing to a greater or lesser extent, depending on where you are. I was struck in reading your book and reading about these different epidemics and pandemics about the parallels to COVID-19, not always perfect parallels. So you talked about being in Rome for a cholera outbreak, but you also talk about an earlier cholera epidemic in, I believe, Venice in your book.
And yes, and Naples in particular.
And Naples, which were incredibly devastating. Cholera, as you described, was more virulent several hundred years ago than it is today. It's mutated and become slightly less dangerous. You describe how it discriminated in terms of class. So the lower city in Venice was just completely devastated. And the poor people living in tenements there were the most affected. And some of them were understandably really distrustful when doctors or priests or public officials or public health workers came to try to, help out in some way or institute certain health measures that were based on miasma theories mostly. And you also describe the way that that people set up some demonstrations to express defiance by eating overripe fruit, which they had been urged not to eat because it disposed them to contracting cholera. Can you talk about when you kind of have lived through this year of COVID? Do you see similarities there?
Oh, well, yes. Some of them, the ones that happened during time of cholera, were things that are real, but for reasons they didn't apprehend. The idea then, it seemed plausible that this wasn't a disease. Cholera is very different from COVID-19, and it strikes people suddenly, and it actually looks like you're dying from a poison. In fact, if you have, people have rat poisoning, and in fact, if you administer that, it produces the symptoms that cholera patients experienced. And so it looked more like a poison than a natural event. And also because it's transmitted not like COVID through the air, but through contaminated food and water. Therefore, people, healthcare workers, doctors, physicians, didn't actually catch it, because you could treat and tend to patients with impunity as long as you didn't actually take up residence in their tenement and share their food and this sort of thing. So, but that looked mysterious. How can the doctors be here and they never ever get sick while we're dying like flies, and that the more doctors there are, it seems the more sickness is being spread. So there was a great sense of class disparity, inequity, and this led at the time to riots. In our day with COVID-19, it's not quite like that. There are major disparities. And it's true that the wealthy in New York City, just like the time of plague and cholera too, they fled. And New York had, that's one reaction that people have to plague. The wealthy didn't succumb in large numbers, at least in the first part, and disproportionately affected were caregivers and also people who were ethnic minorities, Native Americans, Hispanics, and African Americans, and people living in nursing homes. The elderly were the great victims. So there really was an enormous disparity, but this didn't lead to the sense that the poor haven't started to accuse the rich of poisoning them. It seems, oddly enough, it's a little more the other way around, that people are saying that it's a plot to take away their freedoms, and masking is an offense against masculinity and freedom and heaven knows what else. And so we have a lot of defiance. And you mentioned the eating fruit that health authorities said they shouldn't eat. Well, we have our variant of that with the Corona parties, so I don't think, we haven't, alas, advanced as much as we would like to think in our way that we consider these events. And we need more, as you were saying, guidance from public health and scientific figures, both from our educational system and also after it has broken out. The public needs to be educated, and that didn't happen here. And I think we're part of the sadness about this terrible tragedy of COVID-19 is that, yes, we were going to be challenged. And so, yes, it may have led to almost certainly to a degree of suffering, but it didn't have to be a tragedy of this magnitude. That, in fact, is of our own making as a society. And that's really sad, especially when you think of the United States as the world's premier leader in science, and with some of the finest medical centers and medical research centers in the world, and the CDC, which was the world's premier emergency medical response institution. And all of these floundered and didn't serve our purposes during this pandemic. And there's a deep irony, and to me, a sense of great loss and lost opportunity to have been defended better.
There is a lot of debate, at least in the kind of layperson's community, not the medical community necessarily, about how the US has performed as compared to other countries. There are plenty of other countries that have also fared poorly. Some of them have suffered from the same sort of hubristic problems that the US suffered from. Is it abundantly clear to you that we should have done better, and that, to contradict former President Trump, this was not a natural occurrence that was unavoidable?
I think that, to me, the most poignant question, you mentioned Donald Trump, the most poignant question of this whole epidemic is the one that he posed. Who could have known? And to me, that really hit the nail on the head, because the answer to that question is everyone should have known that we had, from 1997, that's a particular year, when we began to enter suffer from the medical consequences of our globalized world with spillover. And the world knew, virologists and epidemiologists began flashing yellow lights. You need to think about this seriously, because we can tell you already that, just as meteorologists can tell you that there's going to, if you live in the Caribbean, there are going to be hurricanes in your future, and you better prepare. So too, virologists and epidemiologists can tell you with a certainty there's going to be a viral pulmonary virus in your future. They can't tell you the date, like the hurricane or how strong the winds, but if you don't prepare, you're going to have a disaster. And that, I think, is what happened. And thereafter, we had all of these more warning signs with media and congressional committees, biodefense. It was a national security issue, this sort of thing. And plans were drawn up, and they pointed out things that, that's extraordinary when the US Congress draws up a biodefense plan, and one of its leading danger points is we don't have any central direction in time of a public health emergency, and that makes us enormously vulnerable. We need to have an authority in place that can take on a national level the health measures that need to be taken, and is sort of a public health czar. That's just one example, but there were SARS and MERS and swine flu, Ebola, and each time there'd be flurry of preparedness, and then people were eager to forget the sort of nasty things and gloomy predictions, and they wanted the good times to continue, and they don't want to spend money, or legislators, on what might be bad news in the future. And right now we're concerned with the economy and all of that. And so there was a kind of feast and famine, with the years of famine being none like in the Bible, being much more numerous than the years of feast, not 7 of each. So this was really one of the devastating features of this period.
Now, there may be some questions from the audience that we can get to. Before that, I just want to mention that, as you say, this was, this threat of diseases, being potentially imminent and forecast, was, going on for over 20 years. In January 2018, I read a New York Times opinion piece by Michael Osterholm and Mark Olshaker that made a really big impression on me. It was called "A Flu Pandemic is Coming." Mm-hmm. And they basically claimed with near certain confidence that a worldwide flu pandemic causing really serious damage was inevitable. And their focus was on developing a universal flu vaccine. But they were highlighting, I think, implicitly just how logistically unprepared we were for a serious pandemic. Is that, I think now that we're coping with COVID, there's a lot of discussion about the light at the end of the tunnel and the vaccine. But it sounds like you and others are saying, the feeling I'm getting is the experts are saying we need to be prepared for the emergence of other diseases, the emergence of a disease that could be unfortunately far worse than COVID.
I would say that in terms of the post-COVID years, I think we need to be aware that just as in the Caribbean, there are going to be hurricanes. And the reason is not by chance, but because we ourselves, by the kind of world we've created enormous pathways with millions of people moving around the globe by airplane, and investment and refugees, immigrants, tourists, all of this, we have created these linkages that make us vulnerable. And so we ought to be aware of that. It just seems common sense that this disease has already shown us how microbes can exploit that link, and they're still there and will be there. And so what we need to do is to decide what can we do about it. And I'm not talking about closing all borders or anything like that. That's not going to work. Microbes don't recognize international borders. What we need are different kinds of policies and reforms and preparedness. That's the story for the future. So I'm not a great cosmic pessimist. This isn't meaning every few years we're going to have another COVID just like we had this time. It's in our hands. The means to contain those outbreaks are ones that are known. And we may have yet more tools in the pipeline if we're willing to fund the research and development of new vaccines of the type you're talking about. And so it's up to us. That's, to me, why it isn't pessimistic. It's a warning. We can do something about this. It doesn't have to happen to us. And with regard to COVID-19 and the light at the end of the tunnel, I'm actually quite worried. Not because, again, I'm this rampant pessimist. It's because I think the good news and the bad news is the same. What happens now is up to us. And my fear is that we're not actually making good use of the time and the period we're in and our resources. And we have made, I think, a kind of fetish of the vaccine. We think we want a single technological fix to get us out of this and get us out rapidly. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I've had both shots myself. I recommend anyone to do that. It took me a nanosecond to decide I'd accept my appointment. But I think that as you listen to what's being said by the World Health Organization and other countries, and it's not this cultural amplification of all of the power of the vaccine. They say that vaccines alone can't possibly do the job, that we need to use all of the resources that we have. And in fact, the vaccines will be more powerful if we deploy those resources. So what have we last seen? 5 states have abolished all mandates for masks, social distancing, closing of bars, places that we all know. If I were Dr. Fauci, I'd be, have what hairs are left on my head, I'd have pulled out, And this, I think, is what makes me worry, this idea that we all seem to be so full of desire for this awful period to end that we want to say, oh, we have the vaccine, that's it, it's gone. And it's not, as one public health official said, and the WHO, we're very tired and fed up with the virus, but unfortunately, the virus isn't fed up with us.
Very sobering. It also seems incredibly concerning to me that as much as there's vaccine reluctance in this country, and there have been, it seems like, significant problems in distributing the vaccine to so many people, it's not clear how quickly or when the vaccine is going to reach much of the rest of the world. Do you know much about COVAX and the status of these international efforts?
COVAX is the main international effort, and it is pressuring wealthy countries to fund the provision of vaccines to third world countries. And what it's preaching is that, I think, the right thing, that this is the right moral choice. But in addition, it's simple self-interest. The reason being, and this is another reason I say that the good news and the bad news is that it's in our hands. To be enlightened self-interest practitioners, as well as humanitarians, we would not just talk about getting vaccines into people's arms in this country. The reason being that if we don't get vaccines into the arms of people all around the world, There will be, the longer that doesn't happen, the more upsurges there'll be of new variants that are more less amenable to our vaccinations and other measures. And so the problem is escalating and becoming more intense abroad, and those variants will inevitably find their way here. And so unless we think about, we're all in this together as a world, it's a species problem. It's not a single nation by nation problem. And that's another, this lack of awareness and attention to that dimension is one of the reasons I'm not just a rampant optimist, but I do believe that we have the tools now. We have to deploy and use them in a scientifically and intelligent way in order to protect ourselves. If we do that, we'll bring this terrible experience to an end, and a definitive end, much more rapidly than if we think we're just going to vaccinate ourselves and that's the end of it. We can open up and have massive gatherings and all of that, the way many people would love to.
Well, I guess I would just, if we can, I'll change gears just a little bit, and we can, we can return to COVID. In your book, Epidemics and Society, you talk about two significant historical events, both involving the French and Napoleon. One on the island of Hispaniola in the colony of Saint-Domingue, and I believe that was yellow fever.
Mm-hmm.
And the second was maybe 10 years later in 1812, when Napoleon tried to invade Russia, and he encountered dysentery going east and typhus going west in retreat, I think.
Exactly.
And that was, in a way, it's just, it's fascinating to hear about the plague and about these historical events, and to realize how long these diseases have been with us, how much they have, for lack of a better word, plagued us, and our efforts to try to contain them. Could you kind of give us like an overview of the significance of those two events and how they shaped the course of at least some portion of history?
Yes, I would say that what happened on the island of Hispaniola was actually, although it's a small place, it's the modern Haiti, which is not an enormous place, but we forget, because Haiti has been so devastated ecologically and politically and economically since that time, that in the early 19th century, it was the world's richest colonies, one of the richest places on earth. And it was sugar plantations that were the source of the wealth, which were cultivated by African slaves. There was, and coinciding with the French Revolution, a rebellion of the slaves under Toussaint Louverture in what later became Free Haiti, and they defeated the French. They defeated the French not only because they practiced guerrilla warfare that the French weren't expecting, and that was clever, but also because they were to some significant degree immune to both yellow fever and malaria, whereas the French soldiers, this was a virgin soil epidemic. They had no immunity whatever. And so Napoleon sent one of the world's great armadas, I think about 50,000 troops, and they died away. And so by in a few months, there was no French army and navy, and so they were forced to withdraw. Now, the repercussions of that were extraordinary. This was the beginning of decolonization. The first free, independent Black republic was set up, but it was more than that. This was, it reoriented Napoleon's plan for holding on to Haiti, Saint-Domingue as it was at the time, was to use it as a base for projecting French power back onto North America. When he lost his base in Saint-Domingue, he drew the conclusion that he had to redirect his efforts. This is one of the reasons that we see is looking east rather than west, but it also meant that he gave up on North America entirely. And so the French possessions, because they were now, he couldn't, now they were going to be a drain rather than a source of power and profit, he sold the Louisiana Purchase to Thomas Jefferson. And so America doubled in size as a result of this experience in Haiti. So we can say that epidemic diseases have these huge political, military, geopolitical, and also regime change, all by these tiny microbes that people laughed at Pasteur for thinking they could affect a grown adult man or woman.
You also talk about tuberculosis. You cover that in a lot of detail, and the transition from the romantic consumption era of tuberculosis to what you call the contagion era, and how that marked a shift in the thinking about, you know, how disease was spread and how it was caught. And I also loved how in the book you talk so much about the effect on, you know, geopolitics, but also culture and the arts. And you talk about, you know, the way that some of us are still familiar with this and still have a sense of how tuberculosis was at first really romanticized. I think someone called it tuberculosis chic, which was this style of imitating, you know, the conditions of the external conditions of having tuberculosis. So women and maybe men also would wear makeup to make themselves paler and eat very little and forego exercise, and even kind of imitate like the lisp and gait of someone suffering from tuberculosis. And I think at that point, it wasn't really understood that the illness was catching from person to person. And because it was internal, it had much less of a stigma than some other illnesses like cholera. But can you talk about what that was like and how that affected people and the kind of change going into the contagion era and how that shift happened?
Absolutely. The point, I think, was that in the first two-thirds, three-quarters of the 19th century, that is down to 1882, there was the prevailing view that this was a disease that was part of your constitution, your inherited nature, almost arose de novo, if you like, although no one actually said that at this point. But it rose from your diathesis, but that's doesn't help very much. That just means your inherited constitution, whatever that would mean. But the point was that the people, therefore, there wasn't a danger of it spreading from person to person. It was, in fact, an expression of who you were almost. And it was a good thing because having tuberculosis was thought, unlike cholera, this awful disease of the gut and terrible symptoms and diarrhea and all of that. I won't take you into all of that. But tuberculosis was in accord almost with religion. It melted away the flesh. And so it left your spirit and it enhanced your genius. And so therefore we see, and the death, people have a wonderful way of inventing things and not seeing what they don't want to see. And the death from tuberculosis is horrible suffering and grotesque, but read in our own country, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which isn't only about slavery, but it's also about tuberculosis. And the death of the heroine here is a beautiful one, her father feels that this is a lovely, beautiful moment in which his daughter is being lifted up and becoming more ethereal with every second. And that's part of the culture of it, just as you said. And people had tuberculosis chic. And there was, everybody knew that it also affected painters and artists. And so there was a sense that it was the elites, again, people seeing what they want to see, that suffered from tuberculosis. And Victor Hugo's friend said his great pity of his life was that he hadn't had tuberculosis, because then he'd have been a greater author. And Keats was thought to be the model of genius, that his poetry was brought out by his experience as a patient of tuberculosis. And so you see that tubercular figures also populate the pictures. Tuberculosis models were thought to be the most beautiful and fashionable. But what happens after I pointed 1882 to 3? Now, the change in popular attitudes takes a while to work its way through. So there wasn't one day when people started to regard the disease completely differently. But let's say that in that crucial 2-year period, Robert Koch discovered the bacterium, that it wasn't part of, it wasn't de novo, if you like, it wasn't part of your inner soul coming out, your innermost constitution, the true you being expressed. Instead, it was a pathogen. And the pathogen, above all, was communicated in tenements and above all in the poor. And it wasn't primarily a disease of the rich, the elite, and the intelligent at all. And so suddenly the public health posters are saying this isn't a beautiful disease, it's a disgusting disease of poverty and terrible living conditions and all the rest of it. And so, and that they're terrible lung blocks. And so tuberculosis then became stigmatized in a way that it hadn't been before. And people tried to, it's like the HIV response. So it was that suddenly tuberculosis people, whole states tried to bar the tuberculosis patients from entering them. It had been the fashion to take the cure also on the Riviera and regain your health, but suddenly no one wanted to go to a hotel where people were coughing. And so the tuberculosis patients were banned from Riviera fashionable hotels. And there was a lot of other kind of panic and hysteria about this particular one. Hysterical physician wrote a report in 1909 that he had a great worry about the United States because tuberculosis was receding at that point. And he thought, if that happens, we'll never have geniuses again. And so American culture, arts, and science are all going to bottom out because we don't have enough tubercular geniuses.
Yeah, that was incredibly striking passage that you noted, that this physician was really concerned. I think he was a physician, you said, right?
Yes.
He was really concerned that
Right.
we were depleting our reservoir of talent because of loss of tubercular patients. And I think that tuberculosis was also the illness that that some people thought that they said, well, Black people can't have this disease. Is that right? Because
Yes. The,
their constitutions don't allow it. This is only for the kind of cerebral white person.
yes, that's exactly right. At the time, this is a long thread. It fortunately not now, almost not now, which is the idea of racialized medicine. And this was the root of the Tuskegee study, to prove that diseases run a different course in Black and white bodies. And so there had been a study in Scandinavia about how tuberculosis had run in the bodies of Scandinavians who were white, of course. And so the United States thought that it might be a good idea to let tuberculosis rip and follow it in the body, in Black bodies, and discover how it will be very completely different and confirm our views that the two races are biologically completely diverse. So going back, yes, it was thought that in fact there were that white people in the Old South could suffer from tuberculosis, but the slave population, they had diseases, but they were different diseases because they weren't eligible to this purifying, wonderful disease of white people.
Well,
again, if you want to believe that, you'll believe anything. But
that's right. It's like the lemons.
right.
So someone has a question asking, considering all the research and documentation that has accumulated regarding diseases and viruses, why do you think people are so reluctant to accept the science of the current pandemic?
Well, I think I do think that's a wonderful question, and it seems extraordinary that it should be so. But there's a difference between one's broad segment of a society accepting the truth of Darwinian evolution and of biomedical science. And that doesn't mean that there aren't at the very same time vast swathes of the population who don't believe that. And we know that there are vast swathes of people in our country who don't believe in Darwinian evolution. And the same people are ones who don't believe in vaccinations. And the very same people also who don't believe in scientific medicine. So it shouldn't surprise us as much as we like to think, because we oversimplify, I think, in our imaginations and think that just because a scientific idea has been established, that everyone agrees that it's established and everyone even knows about it. So that's, and there's a propensity that so many people, no matter what, believe what they want to believe, rather than what a scientist could demonstrate to them. So that's an ongoing issue.
And you talk about how when inoculation and vaccination first began, people were, the late 19th century, people were very suspicious of it then as well as today.
Oh, absolutely. In, let's say, the UK, I choose that because it's Jenner, who invented vaccination, was English. So it's a good place to start when you're talking about vaccination. And this was vaccination against smallpox. And in opposition to him, the anti-vaccination movement was actually the largest political movement of the 19th century. Was opposition, because largely, again, on religious grounds as well. It was thought, well, in fact, this is actually a forerunner of what we're hearing in our own daily press today. Religious people were very concerned because they thought that human bodies are especially sacred, and therefore you shouldn't put inferior matter into the divine human body. And that if you did, you'll start, because the vaccine, you'd grow cows' horns and hooves. And there were lots of cartoons about people sprouting hooves and horns and tails and all the rest of it, and their bodies being debased by this foreign matter. But then there was also the same idea that this was a compulsory vaccination. That was tyranny. It was against your freedom, and that if you were, I'm being sarcastic now, I'm not trying to assert masculinity as an ideal, but they would say if you're man enough to do without a vaccine, you should be allowed. That's your prerogative and part of your rights as a freeborn Englishman, that sort of point of view.
And that seems to be the approach that speculate that Trump was taking when he secretly got vaccinated before leaving the White House, and didn't tell anybody about it, which was only discovered a few days ago. Someone else asks, the historical perspective is fascinating. However, my unfortunate takeaway is that as a society in the US, we haven't put any of the history to use to help us be ready for the next pandemic. Do you, Dr. Snowden, have any thoughts on how, I guess, we can actually use that historical perspective to be better prepared for the coming pandemics, kind of on a practical level?
I think that that's a very important question, and I'm neither totally optimistic nor totally pessimistic. Once again, I would stress that I think discussions and understanding and drawing the lessons from this experience are critical, and therefore insisting with our politicians and representatives that they act on those lessons, that they take this history of this pandemic at least really seriously and realize that we really blew an opportunity, and in a major way, and that this was a tragedy that was foretold and to a large extent could have been prevented or at least vastly ameliorated. And I think we have to make known our wish that this must never happen again. That's not too much for voters actually to ask, that we don't want to have another year where we lose 500,000 people to a disease that could have been prevented. That seems to me something that I could get around in a nanosecond. And I would think that lots of other people want to too, but it means we need to stop having magical thinking, that this was all, we can sweep it all away in one magical moment with a shot in the arm, and think about how did this really happen, and focus a bit on what we need to learn and what we need to do to make ourselves safe in the future. And my optimism then is that we can do that. There's no inherent reason. I think doom would be saying there's like the bubonic plague, God has doomed the earth, and repent ye, because the end is nigh and no one is going to live. That to me is doom. We have no control over this. I'm saying something completely different. I'm saying that terrible things can happen, but we have actually the means to deal with that and to make it not happen. It's up to our choice and our will and our commitment to do so. So that seems to me a guarded optimism.
And that's a good note. Thank you. And also, it seems to me that maybe another historical lesson that you talk about in your book is the optimistic hopes that some people had that were maybe unfounded, of total disease eradication or total infectious disease eradication in the mid-20th century. And you focus specifically on that and how those, we've only been successful, as you note, in eradicating completely intentionally one human disease, which is smallpox. We've attempted to eradicate polio, but we haven't been successful completely. So it seems like that's also, is that kind of a similar sort of hope for a magic bullet that we can just get rid of all these problems with various medications maybe, rather than making social and political changes that we have to make to prevent or minimize the damage of these illnesses, which are maybe inevitable for now.
The point is that also that diseases are variable, and some diseases are susceptible to being eradicated. And for them, it almost is saying that I'm contradicting myself. For a small, narrow range of diseases, the magic bullet of the vaccination is sufficient to do the job. Smallpox was like that, but unfortunately, so many diseases are not. And COVID-19 is now showing that it's not, the way you can tell, it's not so difficult or arcane. The diseases that are most susceptible to vaccine strategies as a standalone weapon are those for which the human body develops a robust and durable response. That's true of smallpox. If you get it once, you never have it again. So all the vaccinators had to do was to find a way to teach the human body to reproduce what nature did. And COVID-19, as we're now learning, above all in a place like Manaus in Brazil, where almost everyone got it, and now they're all getting it again, the immunity is not guaranteed to be robust and lifelong, and therefore simply eradication won't be possible, and controlling it will require the vaccine, yes, but that as a standalone strategy isn't going to do the job. That's the difference between the two. You have to make distinctions between disease and disease, and the idea that there's a technological fix for every illness on earth simply isn't true. We also thought malaria we'd eradicate with DDT. That was also an illusion. And lots of diseases, because we allow their mutations to proceed, evolve into disease, that is to say, resistant disease, antibiotic resistance is a major problem that we face as a society.
Well, much more to discuss, but I want to thank you again so much for joining us, Professor Snowden. This was a really illuminating, helpful talk for me, and I think for a lot of other people. Before we go, I just want to announce that we're going to be talking a little bit more about COVID-19 on Monday, March 15th at 7 p.m. We're going to be joined by Johns Hopkins microbiologist, Dr. Sabra Klein. And there's some more info in the chat. You can check out the website if you're curious about it. I would urge people to check out your book, which I am remiss for not having centered in the beginning. And we'll all be like looking excitedly towards your coming work about COVID. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Goodbye now.
Have a good day, everyone.